In August 1814, James Monroe was Secretary of State, but he had spent the War of 1812 lusting after a military command. The aging Virginian longed to be in uniform on the front lines, but his confidants regularly cautioned against taking the field, and President James Madison had denied all of Monroe's requests for a military appointment. Still, Monroe's desire to fight was understandable.
Monroe has experience serving in the military. He had been in the military during the American Revolution. He is still addressed really throughout his life as Colonel Monroe by a lot of people. He was involved actually in the crossing of the Delaware. He's injured at the Battle of Trenton. In fact, if you see the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, there's a guy right behind Washington that's supposed to be James Monroe. So he's known as a military figure.
When the opportunity arose for the old war hero to direct troops, he took it. By the morning of August 24th, it was clear that the British were marching on Washington through Bladensburg. Leaders on both sides knew that a battle would take place at the Maryland town just a few miles from the capital. In Washington, Madison told members of his cabinet that he intended to be present at the battle to act as the final authority on military matters and to encourage the troops. And Madison wanted some of his cabinet with him, including Monroe. Monroe asked if he could leave for Bladensburg early, while the President, the Secretary of War, and others finalized battle plans. Madison granted his Secretary of State permission to head to Bladensburg, adding that Monroe might see what he could do to help. Monroe took this directive to the extreme. In Bladensburg, he found a motley collection of American militiamen, regular infantry, cavalry, marines, and sailors hoping to halt the advance of British soldiers en route to the capital. Their apparent disorder worried him.
The Americans, it's a lot of militia versus trained military. The generals aren't sure what they're doing. Monroe tries to move some of Brigadier General Tobias Stansbury's troops and probably moves them in a worse direction. The whole thing is a mess.
Indeed, when Monroe arrived at Bladensburg, he found an army in what he feared was disarray that he tried to correct. Stansbury, who commanded some 1,500 of the 6,000 Americans present, had created a defensive line on the western side of what is today called the Anacostia River. The line consisted of artillery and riflemen and was supported by infantry placed some 50 yards behind. Monroe thought the placement of these infantry regiments left them exposed and would make it easy for the British to turn them. Acting unilaterally, on the authority Madison had implicitly given him, Monroe ordered 2 infantry colonels to move their troops to a hill 500 yards behind the front line, too far away to protect the flanks of the artillery and riflemen like Stansbury had wanted. Monroe then moved the 5th Baltimore from the right flank of the front line to the hill the other 2 regiments now occupied. And before the Annapolis militia could take its position protecting the infantry Stansbury had tasked with supporting the artillery and riflemen, Monroe sent them to a gun encampment on the heights a mile from the river. Finally, the Secretary of State ordered Cavalry Commander Jason Laval to ride his horsemen into a ravine to the left of the newly created militia encampment on the hill. Unsurprisingly, from this low ground, Laval and his men could see little of the battlefield. Monroe had no official authority beyond Madison's offhand remark to order any of these maneuvers, but he thought his military experience could help ensure a successful defense of Washington. He should have known better. But the battle had not started. The British were still on the eastern side of the river, and there was time to correct Monroe's tactical blundering. Yet no one did. Stansbury noticed the reconfiguration of his troops and was furious, but when he learned Monroe was responsible, he stayed silent, letting the new deployment stand. After all, Stansbury wasn't a trained soldier. Neither was Brigadier General William Winder, the highest-ranking officer at Bladensburg. Although both noticed the obvious deficiencies of Monroe's formations, they saw the veteran as their military superior and didn't want to undercut his authority. They also may have thought that he knew something they didn't. Monroe's capable service during the War of Independence had resulted in high praise from George Washington himself. The father of the nation had called the younger Virginian a brave, active, and sensible officer. Would such a man make such obvious mistakes? And maybe Stansbury and Winder were afraid of upsetting Monroe's sense of honor. Historian Joanne B. Freeman has called Monroe a man of the sword. He was willing to defend his character and competency with violence, if need be. Whatever their reasons, Stansbury and Winder let Monroe's deployments be. And then President James Madison and Secretary of War John Armstrong appeared on the scene. As they surveyed the troops, Madison gave Armstrong the opportunity to suggest alterations to their deployment, but the Secretary said that everything appeared to be as good as circumstances permitted. Monroe's configuration stood as the first British soldiers appeared on the other side of the river. The battle was a rout. Facing battle-hardened British veterans, the first two lines, the artillery and riflemen at the river, and the infantry Monroe had placed on the hill, quickly broke and fled. Even the stiffer resistance put up by the third line soon faltered. The enemy had a clear path to Washington. Monroe's interference probably didn't affect the outcome of the battle. Although the Americans had the numerical advantage, they were rank amateurs compared to the seasoned British regulars. Still, the future president's meddling certainly didn't help. Desperate to command troops, Monroe leaped when an opportunity to do so presented itself, and fell short. Still, his reputation wasn't hurt by Bladensburg. Observers like Nellie Parke Custis blamed the defeat and the subsequent burning of Washington on the soldiers who fled, their ineffectual generals, and James Madison. In a poem written after the battle, Custis said,
"The sun on Bladensburg shone bright when Britain's troops first came in sight, and every one foretold a fight would end in death or victory. But long our land shall rue that day, when seized with sad and sore dismay, our valiant bands soon flew the way, covered with dust and infamy."
James Monroe avoided that infamy. Despite Armstrong's description of Monroe as a blundering tactician, despite Stansbury's later condemnation of Monroe's orders, despite Monroe's own acknowledgement that his reconfiguration was less than brilliant, the old colonel was named Secretary of War shortly after the battle. He occupied that role for the rest of the War of 1812.